Hello and welcome everyone. This is Taka Movie Talks. I am joined here today with Matt, aka War Champ. Matt, we watched two Kiyoshi Kurosawa films. These are Japanese horror films, and I think Cure being more of a thriller and Pulse being more of what you would associate with a classical horror film. And to kind of only slightly deviate from the question I normally ask you, which is how were you introduced to this director? I want to go slightly different and ask you how were you introduced to Japanese horror, because it is such a rich subgenre that a lot of people, including American audiences, have come to love.
That's a good one. You might have to remind me of some other Japanese horror movies I might have seen. I think House might be my first actual introduction. Have you seen House?
I have such a surrealist, crazy off the wall movie.
Yeah, yeah, and that one is like incredibly creative. And I feel like I could show House to almost anyone, movie lover or not, and they would probably enjoy some aspect of it. And then I saw Cure in at the AFS theater, uh, kind of like a year or two ago, and I thought it was really good. And on the rewatch for this episode, I stand by that opinion for sure.
Yeah, Cure is such a interesting piece, feels dark, gritty, and I think the horror elements really do work, in my opinion at least. And some of the Japanese horror films that a lot of people really, really like and hold in high esteem are films that I have not yet seen, though I do intend to at some point in the future. Those being Ringu, which of course inspired The Ring, the American version that most people might be more familiar with, English speaking audience members at least. And then the movie that would also go on to inspire The Grudge, which I believe is called Ju-On, um, which is Ju-On the Grudge, Ju-On the Curse. It actually went on to become a fairly long series with different installments. It's a very rich subculture of horror, I would say, that Japanese directors have created, and I do find there to be some distinct elements that stick out, especially in comparison to American horror. And just from talking about Pulse, The Grudge, Ringu, you see that they definitely have much more of a focus on the spiritual element of horror as opposed to maybe a Friday the 13th or a Halloween, like a kind of slasher movie, at least in my experience. And even House is a good example of a spiritual horror. But Cure does, in some ways, while introducing more supernatural elements, begin to kind of get closer, at least, to that slasher genre.
Yeah, like when you just mentioned The Grudge, it made me think about kind of the similarities between all the films you talked about just now, and the ones we're talking about today. Is they all, like you mentioned the spiritual thing, they all kind of like what's scary in them is not really based in reality. It's this kind of like otherworldly demon monster, like thing. And when you have like compared to stuff like Friday the 13th or Scream, those movies are more based in reality. So I don't know if it's like a maybe a more cultural thing where Americans maybe more scared or attracted to scary movies that involve like real killers, maybe because we also in America, people are really into true crime stuff, and maybe
Mm.
in Japanese culture, which I'm not as familiar with, maybe they have more of a fear of like the unknown.
Yeah. I think that's a very valid point, and I definitely think a lot of cultural differences probably they contribute to that hyper focus on the spiritual realm. And I think part of it also may even come down to religion, just because, Catholicism being so strong with Western audiences, and obviously that not being so much the case with Eastern audiences. I think there's even halls dedicated to spirits in Japan, if I'm remembering correctly. So I think it's much more front of mind with Japanese audiences that there is a soul, and that soul can very much exist in the realm that we all exist in. And I do think that because it's different from what we expect for an American horror, we do have a lot of kind of ghost based movies, but it's not maybe the most popular subgenre in horror today. I think it's why it can be so refreshing for English audiences to then go and watch these Japanese horror films. And I do think it is what has helped contribute to its popularity amongst English audience members.
Yeah, and another thing that just popped in my mind is I feel like maybe for Japan, they seem to be like into like monsters more. Like I think
Yes.
of other Japanese films like The Host or something. Like they love like creatures and monsters, whereas we like a lot of the times, the bad guy is just like someone in a mask.
This is a great point that you brought up, Matt, because um, let us not forget one of the maybe most iconic horror series of all time, Godzilla, spurred out of
Mhm.
Japan, deeply inspired by the events that occurred in World War II, in what would, the nuclear bomb that was dropped there, and helped peak the interest, or I guess the creativity of storytellers to think, well, what could be the outcome of such a profound thing to happen historically. And we kind of had that same movement in America as well during the Cold War, ironically, as the nuclear tensions were rising. A lot of outer space and monster movies became popular over here, but they definitely do have a rich culture when it comes to horror by itself. And I do think that Kiyoshi Kurosawa is at the forefront of what horror was pushing in the 20th and 21st century as well.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I totally forgot about Godzilla, but I that's like might be the most like iconic monster movie coming out of Japan. Um, but yeah, and I think these movies, like I felt like they really captured that, like also that like early 2000s 90s Japanese aesthetic, that whole like
Mm.
uh, when it comes to like the outfits, the houses, like the everything. It's a very it's kind of like they were a little head ahead of Americans in terms of like digitally, and that kind of stuff. And I think you see that maybe in his, at least in Pulse, his attempt to make CGI, which now it looks a little cheesy. That was one thing that threw me off. But like you can tell they're trying to be more advanced. Another thing I just remembered is like that's that part in Pulse where they're looking at the computer, and it's like and nowadays it looks kind of dumb because it was like the all those stars. Do you
Mm-hmm.
remember what part I'm talking about? And like back then, like that was probably something, in 2001, that that was completely new. And so it was very like mesmerizing probably to people at the time. But now when I saw it, I'm like, okay, that looks like a screensaver. Like, what's so cool about it?
I completely agree with you. Um, he definitely felt like he was trying to kind of push the bounds when it came to that aspect. One thing that I found interesting, just kind of perusing Kiyoshi Kurosawa's his Rotten Tomatoes page was that, well, he made a documentary on Hitchcock and Truffaut, so you can see that he was likely inspired heavily by Alfred Hitchcock when it came to the horror genre and the thriller genre, which he touches upon in the two movies that we're going to discuss, but also that amongst his highest rated films are the two films that we're going to be talking about. So I think, Matt, you made some really good choices as to what to cover for Kiyoshi Kurosawa.
Yeah, I'm excited. These were both great movies.
Which film would you like to discuss first, Matt? Cure or Pulse?
Let's talk about Cure first.
Okay. So Cure is, like I said, a thriller kind of with large horror elements where we predominantly follow a detective who is trying to unveil what is going on behind a string of murders in which the victims end up with the same mutilation in every single case, and that is an X being carved somewhere on their body. And this film relies heavily upon the kind of thought of hypnosis being used as a murder weapon, for lack of a better term, which is not really something I had ever seen done. And if so, I don't believe I've ever seen something done that effectively. And to me, Matt, I found that to be actually extraordinarily scary. The thought of not being in complete control and like losing yourself and having someone else's will being brought about through your body. What did you think about that premise, and then overarching thoughts about the movie as a whole?
Yeah, on the rewatch, I remember I was figuring out again. I was like, okay, like it's it's hypnosis. It's the way he like manipulates the light and the water to entrance people in. And I thought, like, uh, I think that's some of, if not like top three most creative, like horror narratives I've ever seen. I think it's like you said, like you don't see that plot line in like any other movie, and it's definitely freaky because they're like using psychology. That's a big part of the film, is like his psychological books and his studies. And at the time in the 90s, it was probably hypnosis was one of those things that people would still question, whether this is effective or not. So I imagine that when people saw this, even still today, like it would make me want to go look into hypnosis and see like how legitimate is this? Like, could something along the lines of what happens in the movie happen in real life? And that's the kind of thing that I've said time and time again, makes me really love a movie when I get invested in it and I want to go like research something about the film after it ends. That's just like a great that's like the marker of a great film for me. So overall, like I feel like it's just a very scary thriller. Like I love crime movies. It's not only got a great plot, but it's got like great character development. Like especially with the detective,
Mm-hmm.
from start to finish, he's a completely different person. So it works, I think, simultaneously as a character study, as well as has a great like plot line that you can that's fun to follow and like keeps you captured. I don't think I looked away like from the screen once when on even on the rewatch, which is really saying something.
Yeah, that is definitely impressive because once you have an idea of what's going to come, sometimes you can let your mind wander a little bit. But this film is so engaging and captivating throughout the entirety of it. And you talked about the detective, who I also found to be super, super interesting to cover what he's like at the very beginning, where he seems like a more sure of himself type of professional as a detective, and you kind of see him start to spiral, or maybe better put, unravel a little bit, because he's realizing what he's truly up against. And we see how far he takes that when we get to the climactic ending, which is really, really neat to see as a case study. And on top of that, I felt like the antagonist was even just so terrifying, because I think when you get to the psychology of a, and you can't even truly call him a murderer, but he is at the source of the murderer. And just to simplify the way I talk about it, when the murderer is pretty much hypnotizing but pushing others to do these grotesquely violent crimes, and sometimes against the people they love, I find there to be something deeply dark and disturbing about that. And I thought that was such, the whole narrative and premise allowed for that. And it makes the antagonist all the more dangerous, but also in some ways all the more depraved. And I really appreciated that about this film.
Yeah, this yeah, I mentioned the detective, but the antagonist, I'll just call him the murderer as well to make it simple. Is probably like one of my favorite antagonist characters that I can't even come to mind that I've seen in a movie recently. He well, like there's so many like creative and like cool elements about his character, like the fact that he himself seemed to be a psychology student, and it seems as though like we don't know, but he went crazy or he got really deep into this hypnosis study, and then it seems like he did something to himself
Mm-hmm.
to make himself forget, and he's like in a constant state of not being able to remember the past. And then at the same time, you don't really know if he's just lying about all that. So it's like you have this like really like cunning like antagonist that you don't know what his purpose is. Like he doesn't really have a goal. It's just as if he's like this evil being who isn't really even a human anymore, and it's like his job is just to go around and like create chaos. And I just think it's just incredibly well done.
I completely agree. I kind of want to ask you from your perspective, and I think the brilliance of this film is that either works, but and I'm not sure where I really fall on this question myself. But do you think that was an intentional thing, where the antagonist maybe even mesmerized himself, or that this is kind of like a type of Kaiser Soze act that he's trying to pull to get one over on the people around him?
Uh, Clarify who Kaiser Soze is, because I'm not really sure what
Oh,
you're referring to.
my apologies. It's Usual Suspects. If you've seen that film, and if not, I'll.
Oh, okay. It's been a long time, so you might have to refresh me real quick.
So, spoiler alert for anyone who has yet to see Usual Suspects. Um, Kevin Spacey, the whole film you think is just kind of like a lackey who's just working for Kaiser Soze, but at the very end of the film, you realize that he was the mastermind behind everything, and that he didn't have a lisp or a limp. I don't know if he had both, but he didn't have a limp. Like physically, he was all right, and that he was just pretending to be working for Kaiser Soze, so they didn't know he was really the big boss in charge of everything.
Okay, yeah. So for this movie, like, I just a quick spoiler warning. I'm about to talk about the ending, but I think the only time we see where he like that question that you said is kind of like overarching the whole movie. And then at the end, when he gets shot and the detective asks him, like, do you remember now? And he says yes, and then like the detective shoots him like seven more times. Um it's even in that moment, you still don't know if he's being truthful. I just think I just think you can't really know. I feel like he, considering how well the hypnotism was working, I feel like he did it to himself. And there's like another indication of that for me in the film, and that's the fact that we see the detective get hypnotized, like in early on when the rain starts pouring through. Um, in that one scene, and I think they're in his home or something, or they're in one of
Mm,
his places he hangs out. The rain starts dripping through. He hypnotizes the detective, and then right after that scene, he goes up and beats the crap out of his partner for telling the guy about his wife.
mm-hmm.
And then I thought I couldn't quite remember what happened. I thought, oh, like is this a part where the detective's gonna go nuts and like kill his wife or something? But he has this weird he has that moment where he sees his wife dead, but she isn't really. And you think, okay, did he get hypnotized and then like sort of come out of it? And my other thought was maybe he was immune to it, or he's of the same type of spirit or something as the antagonist, because there's another part where the antagonist tells him, um oh, like you can only hear me right now because like you're like me. And that's when they're talking to all those police officers in that one room. And that made me think, well, is the detective like somehow intertwined with this guy? And I think I'm confusing myself a little, but like my point was that whole aspect made me unsure if the antagonist, the murderer, is like really there, or if he's like some kind of spirit influencing the detective in some way, or is he?
Mm.
I don't know. I feel like I'm getting more confused the more I'm explaining it, but I think you might kind of understand what I'm trying to get at.
No, I do, and I think it makes you question even more what the film was, and the narrative still works, but if like the wondering of, okay, was this allegorical or was this real in the universe of the film? It all makes for really interesting speculation and discussion that can happen. And one of the main things that just my own curiosity I found to be the most interesting, that I was most excited to ask you about, and you kind of actually you paved the way for this question when you were explaining it, because I think it gives some backstory that can help me piggyback this question off of. In that, when the antagonist is kind of saying, "You're like me," because there are elements where there's editing to suggest that the detective is under hypnosis for a longer period of time. And I feel like that might have just been talking to him in a way that it's like perhaps they're both under that hypnosis at that time, and that's what he's alluding to, which then kind of leads me to the ultimate question being, it seems as though the throughout the film the detective has visions of his wife being murdered, and then it appears at the very end she was murdered in the very same fashion as all the other murder victims. And to me, it felt like that was supposed to be a great reveal of this film, saying like the detective had finally been activated as a sleeper cell, for lack of a better term. And was that how you interpreted the events, or did I miss anything? What were your thoughts on those kind of elements? Did you find that to be narratively your understanding as well, I guess?
Not exactly, which is what I think makes this movie interesting. The way I interpreted it was I like it was like the detective was going through a struggle like on his own with his wife, and in his business. Like I remember that one guy from the hospital telling him like, you look sicker than your wife right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um and so like he's obviously like this antagonist serves as like a catalyst for his own personal story, and a lot of it I think is about maybe him getting like too caught up in just wanting to catch people and not really focusing on his family life. But regardless of that, I the ending for me, like you were saying, like how he was, your interpretation was kind of how he was a sleeper cell the entire time. So for me at the end, I thought, and I only got this because like my girlfriend who was watching with me actually like commented on this. The place he was eating, at the very end, the the girl, there was a girl walking around in like the restaurant dressed as kind of like a nurse slash waitress outfit, and my girlfriend was like, hey, that's the same girl who was working at the like the mental hospital at the beginning or something like that. And I was like, what? Like, does that mean that he's in it, that the detective is in the hospital? It looked like he was in a restaurant, but is he really in, like is he in the mental ward and he just doesn't think he is? That was like kind of like when you said that, I was like, oh, is that what the movie's going for? Um, did you notice that at all?
I did not notice that, and that's kind of mind blowing if that was the intent, honestly, because I missed that, but it adds a completely new twist to the ending.
Yeah, that may be that may be completely wrong, but I remember it was highlight. It was like the camera was emphasizing that girl walking around who was serving, and I was like thinking, and then the movie just ends, and I was like, wait, like who was that? And then she said that's who it was, and I was like, well, if that's the case, then that's got to be the twist, is that maybe he himself has been like crazy this whole time.
Now, I do think that that's a very interesting thread to kind of go down because the film emphasizes Mesmer, who, if I'm correct in this, and it's just kind of a leap, but I feel like it's a safe leap because it makes sense in my mind. I would think Mesmer is who the term mesmerized is coined after. Probably his studies in hypnotism led to that, but he is a psychologist. And I feel like Kurosawa might have been trying to point us the psychological route through that. And maybe it's allegorical for temporary insanity. Do you think that was something he was trying to strongly emphasize through this film?
Yeah, it's hard because it's hard to say. I mean, you have all these different characters, and it seems like, without a doubt, every time he successfully hypnotizes them, and then he's planting these ideas in their mind. I think that the time we get the most uh like we get to see that is when he's doing it to the doctor. He's like telling her, "Oh, you weren't supposed to be like a doctor because you're a woman. Like, doesn't that make you mad? Like, you should do something about it." And then, we see her had stabbed that guy in the bathroom, like just a couple of scenes later. Um, I in terms of like a higher, like a point he's trying to make about mesmerization and temporary insanity. I am not really sure what it would be. Like what are your thoughts? Help me out a little.
I think it's by having that be embodied by a character, I think you are able to begin to understand how truly horrifying it is in reality. That's the way that I look at it because, I mean, think about it. When one of the scenarios in the film that I actually think we see more often is the kind of newlywed couple, which I think is maybe one of the first victims of this that we actually get to see the antagonist meet. Where, unfortunately, that does happen. Where couples, there's stress that builds up, and then there's a snap with one of the partners, and generally it's the male partner who acts out violently like that. And we see that in society, but if you think of it in terms of there's a man who's almost spreading this thought pattern like a plague, it becomes something real that we can actually look at and examine, thus making it much more horrific. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah, and another thing, that I think he might have been trying to say is there's that whole idea in, psychology and in psychoanalysis where we have like the like we have the inner part of our thoughts. I forget what the exact term for it is. It's kind of like our inner thoughts and feelings, and then we have like the part of the brain that is more active and like outward. And I feel like maybe one of his points was that inward that inward thoughts and inner like mind and or whatever, however you want to term it, stuff that we think about that we don't tell anyone, basically. If you like bring that to the forefront, like I think a psychoanalysis is designed to do, then some pretty terrible things could happen. Because I think that all the murders were kind of like he was basically tempting them to do something that they would never actually do, but they have thought about doing. Like
Mm.
I'm thinking about the best example would probably be the police guy who, when he's explaining why he just went like shot his partner and killed him, he's just like, oh, I never really liked him very much anyways. And it's kind of like, well, like even if you didn't like him, like what makes you kill him? Well, that's like it's kind of like he's turning everyone into people that no longer think about consequences. And like if you have an impulse of, oh, this person's annoying or I don't like them, then you just go and shoot them or
Mm-hmm.
you just go kill them. And it's so I think maybe that was part of his like theme or point of the movie, is kind of those like in evil inner thoughts and feelings that everybody has but no one actually acts on.
Yeah, because in a lot of ways, the antagonist almost seems like a projection of, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, the inner thought element of the mind, I think you were talking about, I think it's called the id, if I'm correct. And then like the kind of outward is the ego, I believe, which keeps us in check. I could be wrong on that, but the antagonist seems very much like a projection, like you said, of those like dark impulses that we oftentimes keep in check, but in this specific scenario they are allowed to act purely based on that part of the mind and nothing else.
Yeah, yeah. I think you had the terminology correct. Oh, and it's also, I think, referred to as like the subconscious,
Mm.
and the conscious is another way I've heard it. But yeah, I think that's something he's trying to get across here, because I think of another thing that the antagonist asks everyone. He's like, "Who are you?" He like wants to know deep down who they are, what their feelings really are, and then I guess the hypnosis kind of manipulates those feelings and makes them want to go act on it.
Right. And like I think in the cop situation was a really good one that you brought up, because I think a lot of people, anytime you're working closely with a group of people, there's going to be scenarios, over the span of a career where you think, oh my God, I could kill that guy. But no one truly means it because of how your brain regulates that. But that thought crosses probably everyone's mind on a daily basis, but no one actually goes through with it, or at least very, very rarely does this happen. And the thing that I think even further cements the fact that this antagonist could very well be allegorical for a part of each victim's own mind is that he seems so much like a blank slate. the element that we discussed about was he himself hypnotized, I think works in towards exploring this avenue because he's so not a real person in the sense of a personality that it seems as though he is merely a projection of just the inner basic thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good way to explain it. It's like he isn't really a person. He doesn't even know who he is. It's like he's been overcome by this evil spirit, and he's going around getting people to act on impulse. Like when I think of the type of person who would actually act on just not liking someone very much, and then they go and kill them. It's someone who is extremely impulsive and doesn't care or doesn't recognize that consequences are going to happen. And that could be like a psychopath, and it also in the same way is like a child, like and I think that because children are very impulsive and they oftentimes don't think about consequences. So like when you're getting these people to act on like these inner feelings and these like deep uh dark things, it's revealing, I think, about human nature, and as well, because like the detective represents, I feel like how almost anyone would react to who was a cop and who was like interrogating someone who legitimately couldn't figure out like who they were, or give him any straight answers. And that the fact that he's like that is just so frustrating. And I feel like that kind of impulsivity and that whole kind of thing is just frustrating to people. Like people don't like that.
I completely agree. I think an added element to what makes the antagonist so interesting is that he seems as though he has no real motive whatsoever, and I think that it makes it even scarier for people to try to wrap their minds around.
Yeah, and it, I think adding on to what I was saying about the frustrating thing, like when you think of what he's saying to everyone, he's just like talking in circles. He won't answer their questions. He just continually asks them questions. And in a way, it's kind of like it's similar to like what a psychologist or psychiatrist would do. And it's like the fact that he's doing that is like, I don't know what I'm trying. My point I'm trying to make is, uh, I I'm sorry. I think I lost what I was trying to say.
Well, in a way, he seems as though he's like fishing through your brain waves to try to
Yeah,
find your innermost desire or your innermost violent impulse.
yeah, and people don't like respond well to that. Like, it just frustrates them unless they're going into like a psychoanalysis session and they're expecting that. It's not something that's comfortable, that people are like comfortable doing or talking about usually. But it's just the fact that he can hypnotize them with like the water and with the light that gets them to do that. And I it just makes me wonder, like, is anyone in real life been able to really accomplish something like this?
There's been tons of theories about this, and one actually kind of goes back to one of the statements I had. I'm sure you've heard of sleeper cells, though I don't. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't know if there's ever been an actual example that's known to the general public. And that would be kind of what is happening here, though the crimes in this film are based on personal relationships, whereas a sleeper cell would generally be like a public figure that they don't know.
Remind me what you mean by sleeper cell.
So I think it's from I don't know if it would be science fiction literature or what, but it would be essentially you give like a coded message or just a message or mission to a soldier, and then they're going to go and live without really any knowledge of this mission, and then there's going to be a phrase that kind of activates them, and the thought is, they would turn into an assassin just based on a phrase. I think there's a movie about it, though I haven't seen it myself. I think I could be wrong. I think Manchurian Candidate is an example of a sleeper cell. I might be getting my movie titles mixed up, but that's essentially what it is.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think like in a way he really is like the antagonist is planting ideas in people's head, but at the same time, like the other way you can perceive it, which I think is honestly the more interesting way, is that he's not really a person, kind of like we've been saying, but he's just this. He's like this representation of what people have to think about or deal with when they're engaged with these like dark thoughts, when they really have to think about like who they are themselves. And so in a way it's kind of like these ideas have been dormant in their mind this whole time, but now they're kind of coming to fruition. Um and it's it's just very I'm thinking about that one scene where the I mentioned it earlier when it's the same scene where he's asking the detective like, or he's telling him like, you're kind of similar to me. It's when he's asking like the headquarters guy, Farija, some one of the names, like the headquarters cop, and he keeps asking him like, who are you? And he's like, I'm like Fujiwara of headquarters. And then he's just like, no, like really, who are you?
Mm.
And so I think another kind of aspect or like theme he's trying to get at is like the roles we play in real life often aren't who we really are, like on the inside and also in our personal life. And I think that also kind of rings true with the detective. The fact that his personal life is a mess and his work life is now becoming a mess. And he tries to keep them totally separate. But I think what the antagonist is kind of doing is bringing them together, which that guy does not want to happen. He's making him think about his wife at work, which he obviously doesn't want to do because he gets extremely upset. He's just questioning, like, are you really just this detective, or is there something more? And it's kind of just like the detective's trying to face a mirror in a way when he's looking at the antagonist, like he's trying to face a reality of who really he is instead of just the role he's playing as detective.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head. And it seems as though his this crime and this case are beginning to parallel the tumultuous relationship that the detective has with his wife, where she very much seems unwell, and he's just trying to kind of make it go away or just ignore the obvious signs that things aren't right with her. And it seems like as this case becomes more and more intense, so too does his introspection of that relationship. And I think that's what makes the perceived ending that I had so interesting, is that once it got to a climax, the case, it seems as though the thing he truly wanted was to just not have to deal with his wife anymore, which led me to think that he did murder her. Did you think, A, that she did get murdered, and two, did you think that the detective was the murderer?
I was honestly the wife storyline confused me more than anything else, but I think in the end, I think he did do it because and just think about he technically was hypnotized at one point. I was talking about how he held off and he didn't just immediately go kill someone, but he almost did his partner, but he seemed to be able to hold it together, whereas the other police guy who got hypnotized and like had that X on the wall, he didn't like make it as far. So I think he did succumb to it in the end because it's like after they all talk to this guy, the antagonist. It's like they all change as people, and it's kind of I mean it's similar to that Pulse movie we're going to talk about when they go into the forbidden room. It's like they change and there's like no going back. It's like he's revealed something in their minds and totally twisted the way they act and what they do. So I do think yeah, I think he did kill her at the end. And I think maybe that's why that's why he's in the hospital or that part I'm unsure of, but it would make sense if that was how it all wraps up.
That I would agree. I think that would make sense to me as well, and adds a nuanced level to everything. And you touched upon something too that I want to just kind of highlight because I think it's another brilliant detail in that, yeah, I do agree with you, and I didn't realize it until you really pointed it out that it seems like the violent interaction, because it was so out of character for the detective with his coworker, it seems somehow inspired by the hypnosis. But I think the reason may be that he was able to pull back was because that wasn't his innermost most devious thought, or like it wasn't his id fully coming to fruition. In fact, what he really wanted was to not have to deal with his wife through one way or another, I guess. So I feel like it all connects, and it actually all works quite logically if you kind of look at it that way.
Yeah, like the way the story plays out and the way the scenes like move from one to the other, like it's kind of like Hitchcock feel. Like it makes sense, especially it all makes sense, but you're still kind of confused and wondering what's going on, what's going to happen next. But the other movie I feel like did this really well. The Handmaiden, like it's obviously very different narratively, but it's kind of like you put all these different pieces together and then like of the puzzle, and then at the end like the puzzle's built and you still kind of have to look at all the pieces to figure out like what does it all look like as as the whole picture. um but yeah, like when I think of all the different incidents of the killing, I think of like his wife and his relationship before and while he was searching for the guy, and then it completely changes right after he gets hypnotized. Like I think an important scene for me in getting like my ideas of how the movie or what the movie's supposed to mean is like when he is coming back from being hypnotized and he sees his wife what he thinks is dead, and then she completely and then it completely changes and she's alive and he seems really upset, but then he's kind of like, oh, nothing happened. And then right when he goes to talk to him, the antagonist again, like the first thing he says is like, did you see your wife dead? So it's like he's in his head, like he knows what's going on with the detective. That's why I think they're like it can really be read as that antagonist is like a part of the detective, like it is spiritually like has like when he hypnotizes him, it's like he enters his soul or his body. It's very like it's just in my opinion really creepy and very like creative and unique. Like you don't see horror movies that would kind of that would do it like that, or that would leave you questioning that this would happen. Like I would think in most movie it would show like some kind of like this guy has entered the detective's brain, and that would become more clear on the screen and it would be easy to figure out. But here you kind of have to like put the pieces together, like, oh, he's kind of influenced all these people and got them to kill everyone in the past. And so now what happens when he invades the detective's mind? Well, the detective starts realizing he doesn't like his wife more and more, and how he kind of hates his life. And as he goes and spirals down that evil path, like, things get worse, and then in the end he ends up killing her.
Right, right. And in films like this, law and crime movies, or crime based film that have a law element involved, trying to catch the bad guys, for lack of a better term, they oftentimes strongly rely on, the criminal and the good guy kind of being flip sides of the same coin, in that, there may be one or two decisions away from being exactly in the same place as the person they're trying to catch or trying to avoid. Whereas this is very, very similar to that, but in some aspects he's like a mirror, and basically everything we've talked about really does have that, in that he just bounces any inquisition into himself back at them, and, like you said, makes you become introspective about who you are and what you're thinking at your core. And that just ever so slight twist of the narrative is so creatively done, but so well executed throughout the entirety of this film, and how it puts the complete picture together is just so intriguing. This is one of the most interesting stories that I think I've seen in this year. I really enjoyed it. Let me ask you, Matt, do you have any closing thoughts on Cure?
Oh yeah, the only last thing I was gonna say was I feel like the detective, like a detective in general, is a perfect character to kind of like have this story be based around, because and I'm making generalizations here, but I feel like, at least in the movies, detectives are generally like a very hardcore, like, oh, I'm not gonna like display my feelings, and I'm gonna keep everything inside, and I have like one mission, and it's to catch the bad guy. And so now when you have this person like questioning like who the detective really is, and they're not just simply answering questions so that he can do his job right. He's really like prying into the character of a detective. it it's like dark, and it's not good, and oftentimes, he has a lot of problems at home because he's working on these like really horrific things in his day job. And then not only that, but like the hours for detectives are terrible. So I just think that like a police officer or a detective in general is like a perfect storytelling like tool to get across what I think Kurosawa was trying to say with this movie.
Yeah, and I also, I think we kind of got the point across, but I just want to say it plainly, in that not only were the characters of the detective and the antagonist very, very interesting, but I thought they were terrifically performed as well. Um, Matt, let me ask you, what was your rating of Cure? And just a quick follow up question, because I I've become much more cognizant of this through some films. Actually, one specifically being the Bunel film that we watched, where titles can oftentimes be a lot more important than we think to give them credit for. Why do you think Cure was used as the title for this film?
Oh, that's a good question. Like the first thing that comes to mind is it's a uh, it's like a, I don't know the exact word for it, but it's a cure is supposed to be like a good thing, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
like in this movie, the cure is like this the antagonist coming up and like making them realize all these things, or like bringing their psyche to the deepest darkest pits, and that is the cure for these people. And it's like the cure, it makes them kill and makes them evil and is bad. I think it's a I can't think of the term for it, but I think it's a it's a good word, but in the sense of this movie, it's meant as a pretty evil thing. Like you're being cured from your regular psyche, and you're being taken into the deepest depths of it.
Right. It's like through catharsis, you are now like reborn. Um,
Hmm.
that seems to be the kind of spin that I took from the title. But Matt, let me ask you, what did you rate this film?
I gave this one a 4.5 out of 5. I feel like it could be closer to a 5 for me, because I just feel like this is one of those movies where you watch it and you're like, it would be hard for this director to top a movie like this. It's just so, it's so great, so well done in like pretty much every aspect.
Yeah, I also gave it a 4.5 out of 5, and I just, me personally, I couldn't think of any way that a story like this could be told better, and it's a very interesting story. So, uh, highly recommend it for anyone looking for a horror film or a crime thriller, for sure. And the next film from Kurosawa that we have is Pulse, which seems to be Kiyoshi Kurosawa trying to do his version of a modern horror ghost story. Um, because at the time period, the internet was kind of fresh in the minds of the mainstream, and that is a very strong element of this film. This has two scenes that I just think make for an iconic horror scene. One of them being when one of our characters is first introduced to what I'll call the Red Room. These kind of or I think it's actually called the Forbidden Room in the movies, and it has one of the creepiest scenes in all of horror that I have seen. And then another one being a text prompt on the computer of one of our main characters asking, "Do you want to see a ghost?" Which I just thought was such a good tagline for a movie, and the way that it's brought up felt very fresh, and it catches you off guard, and immediately kind of lets you know what the tone of this film is. Matt, let me ask you, what were your, I guess, first thoughts upon finishing Pulse?
Definitely confusion. I thought it was trying to say so much, and I got a lot out of it. But like, unlike Cure, I couldn't really quite piece together like a general meaning. Kind of like we were just talking about. The other one's a lot about like bringing or going into the depths of someone's psychology. This one, I feel like there's so much to it. Like it says a lot about the internet, and it's even like futuristic in its predictions about things like horrible videos being online and
Mm-hmm.
like shown to everyone. And at the same time, I feel like it's about it is still about like psychology in a way, but then there's a lot like is it about like ghosts in terms of like people that are dead can still live on in different ways, um or is it kind of like uh like I couldn't, for example, I can't really come to terms with like what the forbidden room like represents, or if it's even supposed to represent anything, or like why these people were drawn in, and what exactly is it that's kind of like taking them over or taking over their minds. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this movie, um, but I feel like talking it out with you will help me kind of piece together maybe more of my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot interestingly done, and I think some of the conclusions I came to are obviously subject to not argument, but to speculation, because there could easily be, you know, 5 or 10 other kind of conclusions that you could come to with it. But I find the Forbidden Room to be so interesting a theory, and I think that on its own, like, it works its way into the viewer's subconscious, in that we all just want to know what's in there. And I feel like in a real life scenario, while it would be horrific, but imagine you're surrounded in an actual world where that was a thing. I think the allure would eventually become so great that, you know, you might eventually find yourself wanting to go in just to see what lies behind. Now, when I originally saw the scene where you're inside the Forbidden Room and you see what's inside, I was at a loss, but I do think perhaps just from the element of what the director was trying to say, what if one of his main messages, I think I might have potentially come up with kind of my own conclusion on it, though.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I'd love to discuss that because I didn't really. I think what frustrated me is I never ended up really coming up with a conclusion. Like my best bet was just kind of um, in one camp, it's like these people. It's like the whole temptation theme. Like they really want to go into this forbidden room. They shouldn't do it. And then there's like the other side of like ghosts. Like there was a lot about how ghosts were invading like the physical world, or like there's only enough space for like so many ghosts can fit in the world, and they want to like kill people so that more ghosts can survive. Like there was a lot of that going on. I wasn't really sure what to make of all of it.
Yeah, that element, I think we'll have to basically try to crack the code on that together, because I was not quite sure what the motive of ghosts was, because it seemed like they were trying to lure people to the afterlife. But my thinking, and I think the reason that technology was so prevalent in this film, is it was like a kind of a campfire story that foreboding the potential impact of technology. And I think Kurosawa was trying to say that the way society has been and is going to be sculpted by technology is going to lead to tremendous loneliness, probably specifically in Japan, but maybe even on a worldwide scope. And that unlocking the Forbidden Room and going in illuminates people to the fact that their lives are so, I guess, empty. And that there's not a difference between, the fear that you would have as a ghost, where you have no true physical connections with the people around you, and that you are, I guess, doomed to eternal loneliness. That we are turning our realities into one of loneliness through the advancement of technology. Now, obviously, arguing that today, I think you can find friends online, you can find people with the same interests, so you might be able to argue that that's not so much the case. But I mean, if you look at the constant, there is an argument to be made still that can be a unintended outcome. But that was at least, I think, the main overarching theme that I got from Kurosawa, at least.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense then. Cause I mean, if you think about like the context of like 2001, 2000, like the internet had technically been around for a while, but this was like the first time people were really using it for like browse actually like browsing the web and stuff like that. And so I think that does make sense. Like we're kind of doomed into loneliness by going the computer route. And I think that it's funny that he did that, considering if the iPhone was around in 2001, it would be so much more obvious. And I think that nowadays I like you see a lot more of that, like just relating it to like reality. I I mean that it's kind of like a trope, just be like, oh yeah, why don't you all like go outside and meet people, like you're just inside playing games on your phone all the time. But I mean, really that's true. I think people are getting more lonely in general because when people are separated by the internet, it's just not the same kind of connection as meeting
Mm-hmm.
people in person. Like there's that barrier there where like yeah, you can even video chat with people, but when you're done, you're still going to feel lonely cuz like physically you're by yourself.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something which is probably the brilliance of his message is that if you were and I'm diving pretty deep into it in this, but if you are a ghost, your interactions with the living are kind of these hollow interactions, right? You can't interact the same way with someone as if you were both living and breathing next to one another. And I think he's trying to compare a ghostly interaction to the type of interactions that you could argue you would have with someone online, where it's not the same, and that there is that separation is palpable when you're connecting virtually as opposed to physically.
Oh yeah, okay, so this is kind of starting to like make more sense in my mind. So it's kind of like the reason, they all like they'll shoot themselves or they're hang themselves is that's kind of like them disappearing maybe and only existing online in that case. So well, like the idea is that like the ghosts are the people while they're online. And it's like they're a different like they're a different life form kind of than people. Like I think like you, like I've never met you in real life, so like my conception of you and like who you are is completely different than if we were friends that had met like at school or something. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's it not only like I'm not saying like that you're basically equivalent to being dead to me, but uh, like I think his representation of a ghost is maybe just like this person exists, or we can interpret now that like this person exists in a different realm, kind of like perceptually to me, you would exist kind of in this other realm of like of a person.
Yeah, and you connected a couple of dots that I didn't actually connect myself, but I think it actually works really good in a metaphorical sense that it's not it is supposed to be like they are basically leaving the physical realm, and that they are becoming only an internet entity, like as to say these people are now obsessed with the internet and they live their lives through that alone, as opposed to being a part of the physical realm's everyday life. So it's like when they kill themselves, it's not it's metaphorical, which I didn't connect, but when you just said it like that, I think that that does kind of work when you put it into the message that we're kind of working through now.
Yeah, like what I'm thinking is like if I only had internet friends, I would be extremely lonely. Like even if we, video chatted, I video chatted with all my internet friends every night or like multiple hours during the day. it's just not the same as like being there with the person in real life. It's like it's almost like seeing a talking picture of a person rather than actually seeing the person. So in a way, it's and this is obviously like far reaching, but in like an interpretation, it's as if like other people don't really exist over the internet. I mean they do, but I think you get what I'm saying. Like they exist completely. It's almost like in a different realm. I mean, I think that kind of like, and I'm just kind of coming up like connecting these dots in real time here right now, but like in a way, like you like he might be saying the ghost world is like the internet world, and so when everyone is becoming a ghost, that means like you're only really knowing their online persona. I think another example I just thought of, like all the people I knew from high school that I don't really keep in touch with. They weren't really my friends, but I still have all of them added on like Facebook or something or Instagram, and so I'll see their posts, and I think, oh, like they look real different now, or it's cool that they're doing like this thing or they're living here. But like, am I ever really gonna see that person in real life again? Probably not. So in a way, they exist like on a completely different plane for me, like a plane of reality, and in which they are just like a in reality they are still like in my mind they're the person from high school, but all you see on the internet is like a different form of reality. I think you might get what I'm trying to say. It's just hard to put it into words.
No, I completely agree. In a sense, they can keep you updated on their changes, but the way that they exist in your mind is kind of cemented the way a loved one who's passed away would be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great comparison.
I think, if we're to pull this string even further, one of the characters who makes his way very, very, like pretty much almost to the very end of the film, he's like the male character. He has like longer hair. I think he has blonde highlights in it. And very early on, we kind of realize he's just now becoming introduced to the internet. But, he goes to the computer lab, and we realize in comparison to his peers, he feels, or not feels, but is shown to be quite technologically inept in comparison. And I think that makes sense when you look at the metaphor for what it is, in that someone who's a late adopter of technology and by proxy the internet would be someone who would probably not become a ghost in this story until much later on into the movie, until it's like, hey, everyone essentially is living on the internet now, and the allure is too great for them, and they finally give in as a late adopter.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good like that makes sense in this kind of like theme we're building. Like he has I remember he goes to those computer labs and they like teach him how to different things like screenshot the images and all that stuff. And so it's in a way that kind of represents, I think, like older people, like people older than us maybe who
Mm-hmm.
were born without the internet, and then later on they adopted it. And it's a totally, I feel like the internet is a totally different thing for those kinds of people. And it's crazy because it's even different for us, or for like me and you who are around the same age, who kind of grew up with the internet, but it was very different. And it's not like we grew up playing like with like nowadays, when like kids are given iPhones and iPads very young, and you were kind of like you'll make it to age 10 or 12 and you're already like fully know what the internet is, you use it every day, you know exactly what to do. I still remember like growing up and like people didn't really use the internet, that like it was still a place kind of for outsiders. Whereas now, well, like in the 2000s, it was kind of like that. Whereas now, it's much more, pretty much everybody uses it, and I think that once again completely changes like the whole concept of the internet. Like I guess my point I'm trying to get, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I think the point I'm trying to get across is like the internet has changed so much from this time that like you could, like the story still makes sense. It actually might even make more sense in terms of like the loneliness and isolation aspect, but in terms of like people slowly going online and like and you know like in this movie they'd be killing themselves when they go online. It's like everybody already starts from the basis nowadays of being online. It's like if you're not online, everyone is like, what are you doing? Whereas like 20 years ago, if you were online, everyone was like, what are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it seems as though we both have kind of the same thought in that Kurosawa seemed to really have his finger on the pulse, no pun intended, of what was happening technologically, and that there was a huge technological shift on the forefront, and he seemed to have a very strong understanding of that, which for someone like him who obviously was born pre-internet and even pre-computers, it's very impressive for him to have that forethought to kind of realize how prevalent it would be in everyday interactions, especially at the time period that this film came out.
Yeah, yeah, and I know in Japan too, like I think people are were even more online back in this 2000s era than like we in America were. Like I think it blew up very much before Japan, or in Japan did it blew up, I'm sorry. It blew up quicker in Japan and earlier, the internet is what I'm talking about, than in America. So I feel like maybe he around like the late 90s, 2000s saw this kind of shift happening, and that's maybe what gave him idea for the movie.
I completely agree. Culturally, that it did seem to be, and I'm basing this off of, and it could be um, really generalizations because I don't have a intensely deep knowledge, but from just different sources of media that I've seen, it seems like the arcade scene was such a big element of everyday life for youth, especially growing up in Japan. So I think he saw the mindset of kids to kind of detach and or look to these different mediums and elements to be able to kind of get away from everyday life, and saw that this would take off exponentially the way that it did take off, especially in that environment. So I think he did have like an a culture to kind of base this story off of to make those correct assumptions, which is so great. And I think that's why it probably worked so well when that film came out, because they were ahead of the curve. But I mean, I think you said it best, is that now us American audiences can watch this film 2 decades after it came out with the realization that this was really cutting edge.
Yeah, I think, and we could totally be reading into, Kurosawa's mind here, but like if we're kind of right about his reasoning for the making the film and what he was thinking, then he really predicted, I think, how crazy widespread this whole internet thing was going to become. Because I think like back in 2001, it may not have been like this in Japan, but in America, people just thought of computers as like, oh, I'm going to go play a game, like I'll just go play like Minesweeper on the computer. Or they would go to work and they'd have like a huge boxy computer that they use to do like menial work tasks, or basically it could be used as like a giant calculator. Whereas like Kurosawa sees it as this thing that people are gonna like lose themselves to. Like it has so much capabilities that people are going to invest like their entire life in it. It's going to become like a lot of other entertainment, leisure activities become this incredibly addicting thing that people are going to end up like dedicating their entire life to and spend their entire life online, which is this weird representation of reality, like ghostly representation, you know, and I think that fear possibly is what caused him to want to make this movie.
Yeah, and I think he was rightful to have fear towards what the capabilities are. I think now, not to get too off topic, but now we're living through kind of an AI, uh, I guess I'll call it like a ground zero. You know, we're right at the inception where AI is starting to take off and influence people's everyday lives, where you can send a query to it, you can ask it questions. People are becoming much more comfortable with it in their everyday lives. And I think anytime something new like that comes out, there is a fear to be had, but he seemingly had a lot of forethought, because what he was afraid of, I think it did come to fruition, because I think that's a common criticism of especially the youth of America, but I'm sure it's prevalent in other countries, Japan being one of them, where a lot of people don't have the same meaningful interactions face to face because they might be on their phone so frequently, which a phone at this point, you might as well have a computer in front of you for what it's capable of. I feel like you would also agree, Matt, in that, look, this is a tremendous tool that we can utilize, but it can also be detrimental to a singular person and people at large.
Yeah, so like first I want to talk about kind of what you said towards the end, and then second I'm going to touch on the AI thing. But first, I really think like his you could say like this his thesis of the film possibly, or his like his message is kind of how the internet's going to make people more lonely in general. And I think that that is really turning out to be the truth. Like this isn't what I'm about to say, you know, I had it's not really based in like any evidentiary fact. It's just kind of from my observation. But from what I've seen is people nowadays like okay, one, they're comparing themselves to everyone else online, which like when you know stuff about humans, you know that like people get their people compare themselves to other people they see, and based on those comparisons it makes them happy or sad. Like that whole thing where if you make $100,000 but and you live in a neighborhood where everyone else makes 50, you're gonna feel rich, you know, and then vice versa, same. So you're living in this weird if you're online all the time, not only are you gonna feel inadequate in comparison to everyone else, because the only thing other people posting is the highlights of their life, the good things. But then at the same time, you're not really going out and developing like necessary social skills when you're online. Like online social skills don't translate to real life social skills. And I see all these like Reddit questions and different types of questions that pop up where like people are like confused socially, and I feel like it's because they've spent so much time online. And it's like if you're not successful in real life in like this your social circle, or like if you get bullied at school, you're probably going to end up spending a lot of time online because it's like a safe space for you. And then by spending more and more time online, you're like slowly kind of just getting more lonely and possibly more depressed. And I feel like it's like a dark downward spiral for a lot of people. Like it's a lot of what this film is kind of about, now that I'm thinking about it. But and then the second point on AI, just another like opinion from me is I think the biggest problem with AI in the future is going to be that, and I think I've said this on the podcast before, but it's going to be that no one's really going to know what's real and what to believe anymore. I think
Mm.
that if AI, what it seems to be able to do really well is it seems to be able to mimic things really well. Like you tell it what to do, and it seems to be able to spit out like a generic version, or like if you said, "Hey, like make this video with Tom Brady or with a thing like Tom Cruise in it in a like monster movie." It might generate something like with Tom Cruise in like a scary movie, and then like if it gets good enough at doing stuff like that, people are going to be able to generate all kinds of fake things, and no one's going to know what's true online anymore. That's just those are the couple of opinions I had that I thought were interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree with it, with everything, and I think that's a huge element that gets doesn't get enough thought. Is that the pointed message you got across, which is, social skills online don't transfer, and it becomes cyclical in that the lack of acceptance in a physical social circle can push people towards looking for acceptance virtually, which by spending a lot of time can make the acceptance in a physical circle even harder, just because you're only accustomed to talking to people that way. Um, and I think that's a really good point that you can only truly recognize once you see it in others, because I think it's very hard to recognize when you are the person that is in that cycle. And it is kind of a cautionary tale worth mentioning. And I think the older generations can much more easily recognize that, because technology has infiltrated their lives a lot, but just because they're not native to the technology, it's not as porous into their daily lives. So they can kind of, and they also have the memories of growing up in a time without it. So they have an additional kind of vantage point to look at things. I thought that was a really interesting point you made. And as far as AI goes, yeah, I feel like people are going to be able to utilize that for any number of misinformation. And that's something that's become so huge in social media, especially now. If you look at Twitter, I don't know if you've seen this, Matt, but under posts, there will be insights. So if a post is deemed to be some sort of misinformation where someone claims X, Y, and Z happened, and it's a post that gets a lot of eyeballs on it, if I think a search is deeming it to not be true, it'll give context to the post, and it might be also kind of saying, look, this is incorrect, this is what actually happened. But the internet eventually is going to be so fraught with images that are indistinctable, or we can't distinct them from reality, that we will easily be maybe misguided in one way or another. And it's not only going to be pictures, but it's going to be voices. There's AI technology that can take any famous voice that's ever been recorded, or any person's voice that there is record of, and get it to say anything. I think there's been news stories about these spam calls using voices of loved ones to try to extract money from them. And we are still at the infancy of what this AI is capable of. Um, it's all tremendously interesting, and while there's going to be equal opportunities for kind of bad actors to use that, I am also at the same time excited for what the capabilities will have in the future. But obviously, as with this movie, looking at it through a realistic lens, you have to be aware of what the positives can be, and also, like what you brought up, what the negatives can be as well.
Yeah, like I just think, think about how the internet was in 2001 when this movie was made compared to now. And you think about AI now and then think 20 years later, it's going to be completely different. And maybe a movie now about like Pulse, but about AI made now might be predictive of how they are in the future. I feel like the way the internet has developed, that at least back in 2001 it was much more of the wild west. There was like no regulations, like people weren't really using it because people didn't know how to use it, and that created like this different kind of online thing. And then in the online community back in 2001, Kurosawa might be saying here that, hey, like this could turn out to where it's to be really bad, where everyone's super lonely because they're just living through the computer screen. I think a similar kind of progression could possibly be seen with AI. Who knows what kind of direction it could take, but you think about it now, and it's much in its infancy. In 20 years, it could become the norm and be like the thing everybody is using for different things. Like there could be an app on your phone where you can easily utilize AI to do all these different creative things. And I mean, it's all gonna come with negative and positive aspects, just like the internet. And I think, but what's being highlighted, in this film is obviously the negative aspects of the internet. But yeah, just overall, like the internet has become more commercialized. It's become like the shift is that if you're not using the internet, then you're weird. Whereas in 2001, if you were using the internet, then you were weird. It's it's this very weird, like evolving thing that is kind of the I would call it like the definitive, like thing of our era. Like when you think of like the industrial era of like the world, like when machines were coming out. When people think around these times in 100 years, 200 years are going to be, it's going to be called the internet age, and everything that is kind of like revolves around it. Uh, like it's kind of like what's central and what's important in the world right now. Like if the internet were to shut down everywhere, what would people do? Like people wouldn't be dead, but like all business wouldn't function. It's just crazy to think about that.
Yeah, it would be um almost equivalent to the world kind of just screeching to a halt, just to kind of spitball what the outcome of that would be. And I think a lot of people would be at a loss. But I think long term, I think it could very much lead to people going back to a sense of normal where interactions do more so take place in person, which kind of directly leads to, what we were theorizing the entire point of Kurosawa to be. Um, I'm going to ask you, Matt, any closing thoughts on Pulse?
Oh, just one thing I wanted to add was like how creepy this and just like scary this movie really is. Like
Mm-hmm.
I know you mentioned when we first opened up about how that scene at the beginning, when you first see the Forbidden Room, like really terrified you. Like when you first see the shadow implant in the wall, like that just freaks me out. Like something about the way that the shadow is in the wall and how the person is just kind of like gone, and that little shadow remain. It's freaky. Like it's very scary to me. Like aside from all the internet stuff, like just the movie itself, like I think the whole horror aspect is really well done, and like this movie will definitely scare you. It's not like a jump scary ghost film, but it's definitely freaky.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you did highlight that because, um, yeah, I was very much kind of understating how creepy that is. And there is an element to like when someone, as they do in this film, just fades away. Like, when a person dies, and they just leave their physical being, but they, they're obviously gone spiritually or what have you. That's a tough loss, but if they were to evaporate essentially the way that they do in this film, only leaving that imprint, there's something just so deeply disturbing about the complete loss of someone like that. So I thought that was a really great visual element. And on top of that, the forbidden room where the girl is walking towards the guy who walks in, and how unnatural it looks. Um, Technically, I don't know how Kurosawa did that. I would think in today's age, you would probably go about it via CGI, but it looked too refined, because you do see elements where CGI is utilized in this film, and it's a little rough around the edges. But in that
Mhm.
scene specifically, he would have had to use some type of camera or editing techniques that just came off really, really well. That scene alone is one of the best in horror that I've ever seen, and it absolutely left, like, I had a tingle go down my spine watching that because of how just it was so freaking creepy.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, I mean, they're completely different, but it's that same kind of, I guess, tingle down my spine, you could say, as I got like at the end of Don't Look Now,
Mm,
when you know what I'm talking about, the end of that one. It's
yes.
kind of that same like freaky, like not exact. It's not a jump scare, but it's like it scares you like a jump scare would. It's like more genuine.
Yeah, and I guess just to wrap things up, but there is an additional question. What do you think was the messaging, or I guess what was trying to be illustrated when they show how unnatural the ghosts are?
I'm not sure. Um, I don't know. What do you think?
I think it could fall in line with the whole discussion about the interactions you have online kind of just not being human, to just distill the sentiment in as few words as possible. That there is something unnatural about um, living virtually and connections virtually. I guess, but there could very easily be other interpretations to it as well. But that's the only one that really comes to mind now.
Yeah, because I mean, it's also like I think of the like how the ghosts a lot of times were kind of the people online. Like a lot of it was those videos, those like dark videos of people, killing themselves. Um, and I it's if I try and explain it, I know I'm just gonna get lost in my words. But I think I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we got a really good understanding, or at least a good interpretation that allows for kind of expansion and whatnot. I do feel like, though, there are probably a lot of different avenues that you could run down with this film. And you began to touch on a lot of them. There was seemingly theoretical discussion that, you know, just like a computer memory, the afterlife has a finite amount of storage, and that we're starting to see ghosts in the real world because there's no more room for them. I'm sure that there's like probably even biblical stories that maybe try to tell a story like that. And while we didn't like really explore that element to it, I do find that to just be an additional like little interesting tidbit that Kurosawa put in it, and adds to kind of why my thoughts were. It seemed like Kurosawa was just looking at this subgenre and as a whole, and just completely dumped out his brain and thoughts towards that whole type of story and just let it all hang out in this film. And while with parts of the film it does start to become confusing, probably because of that, it does have a lot of interesting elements to kind of latch on to by the same token.
Yeah, yeah. One of the freakiest things for me is it was like the ghosts lived in the computer and they could like contact the real world, and it was like they were in two separate worlds, which goes even more towards the point that we've kind of been talking about this whole podcast. Um, but yeah, and then I don't know. I'm guessing he didn't intend to touch on it, but I mean the amount of uh I mean all the scenes with like the like basically like snuff films, like people committing killing themselves and other horrible things that get posted online, like that became such a big thing. And like since the dark web or deep web or whatever you want to call it gained notoriety back in like the early 2010s. um and I'm sure he didn't know that that was going to become such a big deal, but like stuff like terrible child pornography and different horrible acts being able to be found online and being able to be sent to and from different people, I think is another interesting like aspect of the movie that he might not have even realized was gonna become like such a big thing in the future.
Yeah, I don't think anyone was quite ready or capable of thinking about the terrible things that would be possible. Um, which is why it is so important to have kind of skeptics look at the advancements being made and say, hey, what are the safeguards, and how can this be manipulated? I do find that so interesting. And I guess before we get into the ratings, and this is a little off topic, but you brought it up and I do find it to be interesting. And we've probably discussed this a little bit before, but I still think it's worth asking. Obviously, the morbid curiosity, it does exist quite prevalently in society. And I guess on a deeper level, I mean, what do you think inspires people to not only seek out like deeply disturbing, I guess aside from child pornography, because I think that while it's kind of inconceivable that people can seek that out, it's much more self-explanatory why they seek it out. But I guess in terms of more violent and real content like that, why do you think people seek that out? And then why do you think that it's so interesting to people that it exists in the first place, I guess?
Yeah, I think, it goes back to that whole, people, if you're driving by a car accident, you're gonna be looking at it as you drive by. Like people like macabre stuff. People like following true crime stories. And like when bad things happen, people become interested generally. But like in addition to that, like I know so many people like in real life, like some of my friends, that they'll follow certain like subreddits or like Twitter pages or Instagram pages that just post like brutal things. Like I think one of the most popular subreddits was used to be like watch people die before they took it down.
Mm-hmm.
I think people just like maybe for the same reason people like scary movies. They want to be scared, but I like like I was telling you before the podcast started how I watched some of those like videos of like Jewish people being like kidnapped and stuff in Israel and being killed. And like after I watched those videos, like I really regretted watching them. I just think there's like a scary movie is one thing, like watching, Irreversible or Martyrs. Like yeah, it scares you, but then at least at the end you're like you feel okay about it because they're all actors. But when it comes to real stuff, like I just like for me when I'm like of course it freaks me out, but when I'm done watching it, like there's no relief. It's more just like anger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that, and I do think, and I would be genuinely interested to hear, um, like a psychological perspective on that, because I think even from personal experience, the extreme video that you get into contact to, I think it can change your mind in a lot of probably ways that we don't even understand yet. Um, and I say that because I think there's definitive proof that you do become desensitized to things once you've seen much more extreme content. You know, once and that works its way even into the movie realm. But once you take it a step further and you look to real life videos being made, um, you're not so much as affected by a movie then, and so on and so forth. So I would be interested to hear the take, you know, on what that actually does to maybe even your brain chemistry. But there is a very real change that you can see in people's mentalities once they have been exposed to that, and it is prevalent, and it is something to be weary of for people who are online.
Yeah, I think that's another really dark spiral. Like, I think absolutely you get desensitized to it because once you've seen some, I mean, I feel like after a while you're just like, you know what? I've seen just about as bad as it gets, so yeah, I might as well just click this one and watch it too. And I just think, yeah, it's a bad road to take because after a while, I mean, I don't think it's gonna make you want to go out and do the stuff with the videos. I just think it's gonna make you maybe possibly care less about when horrible things happen. That's just, you know, my unscientific insight. But I would also be really interested to see um, like what that does uh, to the brain because I think it, like you said, like they're in the past 10, 20 years before that, like you only really saw those atrocities if you saw them in person. Like there weren't really video, like especially not HD video of people, you know, getting their heads cut off or, you know, mass killings being put on camera. Yeah, it's weird. It's a crazy, interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, and I guess there's like kind of two um, distinct elements to that that I find really interesting. And one being individuals who are born sociopathic, and that I think scientifically the understanding is that you're born that way. And I think it's kind of interesting because it seems like we're touching upon the fact that you can be desensitized to the emotions of those afflicted by watching strong media, strong violence in media specifically. And it seems like through research into that, you could almost reverse engineer that and understand the pathways that lead to that and why that is the case in people who are born like that, to see if there's a way to rehabilitate, honestly, which I think would be a net societal positive. But also, an additional thing that you brought up, which is definitely another strong negative. There was generally, it might have just been a societal thought or misconception, rather, that post traumatic stress disorder was something only associated with those who had been in wartime situations. And now you see psychiatrists are they're diagnosing patients with post traumatic stress disorder if they've been in a abusive household growing up, or a abusive relationship with their spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend. And I you have to wonder, because of how intense those sources of media are, if people are acting differently, or their personality changes, or they're so desensitized because that is actually post traumatic stress from watching something that, like you said, would only be something you would see in person that would probably change you dramatically then.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right on the money with that. I think that uh, if they could do a study, that studied this specifically, I think they would find changes in the way people perceive things. And I think that um, one other thing I would just wanted to comment on this was I feel like it can be an addiction of some sort. Like
Mm-hmm.
you think of, well, like you're like, I'll just watch this scary video, and like especially for people who don't feel a lot, like sociopathic, psychopath people who don't, like, a lot of their life is very bland and boring. There's a lack of a lot of empathy and stuff. If you can watch something that makes you like scared, like you're really feeling something. Like when I, watching a terrible video like that, I really feel like sad, angry. It's like some of the most prominent emotions that you can have, and it's easy to do is click a video. So if even though the emotions, like we would associate it with, negative, because you're feeling pretty crappy when you're watching, or at least I'm feeling pretty crappy when I'm watching the video like that, it's still like, it's maybe not a dopamine rush, but it's a certain type of rush that makes you feel something that can become addictive.
Yeah, and I think there's even like, it feels visceral. Speaking from personal experience, when you see like the ending of, or like the middle of Irreversible, that is literally, there's almost a physical feeling, a sickening feeling that you get, where it's much more than just mental anguish. It's so strong that you feel it physically, and there's just very few actual scenarios in real life where you feel emotion that strongly on an everyday basis.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it actually. Like you don't, like in real life, like you may only feel that like when someone really close to you passes away, or if something really terrible happens, like a terrible accident or tragedy. And that might only happen like a few times in your life, but like you may not know the people in the video, but you're still going to feel like these terrible things when you're watching it. That's like pretty similar to what you're gonna feel if like a tragedy happens in real life.
Yeah, exactly. Um, I find it all so interesting, and I do think at some point, hopefully, or maybe it'll be something that's kind of looked into scientifically. But Matt, I want to ask you to kind of wrap everything up. What was your rating of Pulse, and then overarching thoughts and on Kiyoshi Kurosawa?
So my rating was a 3.5. That was, or 3.5 out of 5 stars. I told you at the beginning, I didn't really come away. I came away more confused than anything. But now that we had this discussion, it makes the movie make a lot more sense. So like if I would have came away with what we just talked about, I feel like I would have given it a 4 out of 5 initially. But overall, I've these are the only two films I've seen from this Kurosawa. But I feel like he is a master at making you feel scared, and well, like both of these movies, the other one may not have technically been horror, but they both freaked me out more than, pretty much all modern horror movies do. And that's saying something, because I don't get creeped out by films very much. So yeah, I just think he's excellent at crafting these like really deep, intricate, creepy stories.
Yeah, I gave this one a 4, and like you, I do think that talking it through makes a lot of the points that I would perceive Kurosawa to be going for much more concrete and creative and brilliant, quite frankly. So what I do find through talking over both films and Kurosawa as a whole, me like you, I've only seen these two, but I would have to imagine at some point in the future I'm going to seek out more because he seems to be intensely thoughtful about the messaging he's trying to get across and how he tells that story, whether it be metaphorically, allegorically, or whatever else. And, you know, I mentioned Hitchcock and then you mentioned Hitchcock as well throughout this discussion. And I do think that there is a easy parallel to be made because I find Hitchcock to do something very similar in his films where he seems to think about the minute details of his films very deeply when he is crafting his story. So for people who are very interested into the nuances of a script and a story, this is the director for you, I would say.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Matt, I want to say thank you very much for joining me. This episode was very fun to record, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to record it with me.
Yes, thanks for having me on as usual. I thought this was a very good one. I thought all the stuff we talked about today was pretty interesting.
That's all from us, folks. Y'all have a good one, and we will catch you on the flippity floop. Bye, y'all.